Today we get to talk about the Ancestry DNA update. This happens once a year, or traditionally has happened once a year in the fall, where we take all of the people who have taken an Ancestry DNA test and we run them through the updated algorithm, compare them to the updated reference panel, and then update their Ancestry DNA origins results. I'm Crista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry, and today I am going to walk you through the updated results. I am going to share screenshots. I'm going to walk through some basics of DNA inheritance, just so that we're all working from the same foundation. And I'm going to make sure that we get as many of your questions answered as possible in the time that we have together. If you're watching this live, here's what I would love to have you do. In the chat, so not in the Q&A, but in the chat here on Zoom, would you please think about and then type out one question you have about your Ancestry DNA origins results. I would just love to see in the chat, get a feel for kind of how to direct our conversation today. Now, if you are watching a recording of this on YouTube, I suspect that the questions you have will likely get answered over the course of our hour together today, but feel free to put them in the comments and we will keep an eye out for questions that are not answered in this video. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the chat. And again, here's what I'd like you to put in the chat, which is one question. If you could ask any question, what's the one question you want answered about Ancestry DNA origins results? Okay, we've got questions about percentages changing. We've got questions about certain regions. We do have some questions about the match list, but specifically questions about how they tie in with specific origins data, why regions might come and go. Okay, some specificity questions, particularly around certain regions. Okay, keep those questions coming. I'm going to keep an eye on this throughout our time together today. But I do want to just start us with a foundational explanation about DNA inheritance, because I think that's important to this conversation. Now, this may be familiar information for some of you, but it's always good just to revisit the basics. For some of you, this might be brand new information. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, we're just going to have a quick review of DNA inheritance. So every single person, male or female, inherits 50% of their dad's DNA and 50% of their mom's DNA. And so we have this connection to both of our parents, and that's important to understand. Now, when we say you inherit 50%, what we mean is that you inherit a random 50% of their DNA, not an equal 50-50 split of all of their DNA. And we've got a little example here to illustrate that. So we're going to use some names and letters as a metaphor for your DNA to help you kind of begin to understand this. So let's say that we have a man named Andrew. And Andrew and his wife, Sandra, have a child. Again, every child inherits 50% of dad's DNA and 50% of mom's DNA, but it is a random 50%. In this instance, when Andrew is going to pass on his DNA, he is not going to pass on half of an A and half of an N and half of a D. No, like it's not an equal 50-50 split of everything. It is a random 50%. So here is what that looks like. He's going to pass on randomly 3 letters, and Sandra is going to pass on randomly 3 letters, and that child is going to be Edward. Everybody see how that works? Okay. Now we have another couple. Their name's Graham and Elaine. Same concept. Graham and Elaine are going to pass on randomly 50% of their DNA. That DNA is going to get a little recombined here, and that child is going to be Angela. Now, Edward and Angela are going to get married, and they're going to have kids, and they're going to have a few children. We're going to give them 3. And again, they're going to pass on 50% of their DNA to their 3 children. But it's a random 50% to each child, which means unless those children are identical twins, their DNA is going to look a little bit different because they each got something a little bit different from mom and something a little bit different from dad. Now, they did get some things in common, right? If you look at those 3 children, all 3 of them got a G from mom. A couple of them got an N from mom. A couple of them got an E from dad, and then one of them got an E from mom. Do you see what's happening, right? So you can tell that they're siblings because they have enough of their DNA in common, but they are not identical because every child gets a random 50% of their parents' DNA. Now, if you look at this in aggregate now, we have some interesting things that start to appear. For example, there are things that get passed down generation after generation after generation. And then there are some things that disappear because only 50% of a parent's DNA gets passed on to the child, which means that there is 50% of that parent's DNA that does not get passed on. In this case, right, Andrew passed that W on to Edward. Edward did not pass that W on to any of his children. Sandra had an S. That doesn't show up anywhere because none of her child did not inherit it. Now, there is a little mathematical formula here for those of you who are math-minded people, which is that if one child inherits 50% of your DNA and the next child inherits 50% of your DNA, and they have about a 50% overlap in how much DNA they share, together, combined, those 2 children represent about 75% of your DNA. If you add a 3rd child to the mix, now you've got about 87% of your DNA represented. And if you add a 4th child to the mix, now you've got about 93% of your DNA represented. And if you add a 5th child, do you see what's happening, right? Every time you have another child, you pass on a random 50% of your DNA. But in aggregate, about 5 children are going to have almost 100% of your DNA. But if you have less than 5 children, that means pieces of DNA that you've inherited have not been passed on to the next generation in your branch of the family tree. Now, it's entirely possible that Andrew and Sandra have another child somewhere and that child inherited the S and the N, but not Edward, and therefore Edward does not have it to pass on to his children. Now, of course, DNA is a lot more complex than that. We used 6 simple letters in this analogy to help you understand the concept. But with DNA, we are looking at hundreds of thousands of letters across your genome in order to determine the things that we're going to talk about today. And so, but it's important to understand that you are only seeing what you inherited from your parents. And there is 50% of their DNA that you did not get, which means if you have tested siblings, or better yet, your parents, by all means, if you have parents or grandparents still living, get them tested because they have 100% of their DNA and you only have 50% of their DNA. But if parents or grandparents are not available to test, then you're going to want to test siblings and aunts and uncles and any first cousins you have, because then in aggregate, you can start to see a more complete picture of the DNA of those previous generations. So that is just, again, a basic foundational knowledge about how the random inheritance of DNA works. And it is important to have that foundation when we have a discussion about your DNA origins, because the regions of the world that your DNA connects you to can only connect you to those places if you inherited those pieces of DNA. So having said that and looking at the chat, it looks like hopefully that information answered several of your questions. Why didn't I get this? Why didn't I get that? I know I have ancestors from this place. Why does that not show up in my DNA? Well, it's because that may be the S that Sandra didn't pass on to her son that he then could not pass on to his children. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your Ancestry DNA results. So let's talk about the update. As I mentioned, Ancestry typically does an update every fall. Everyone gets the update, whether they have an Ancestry subscription or not. If you have taken an Ancestry DNA test, your results have been updated. Everybody's results are all updated at the same time. So everybody received the update on the 9th of October this year. And so if you haven't looked at your results yet, you might want to go do that. Of course, if you're watching live here with me on Zoom, if you've got another screen you can pull that up on and follow along, that would be great. If you're watching on YouTube, you can, of course, just hit pause when you need to go ahead and look through your DNA results. But I want you to have that frame of reference as we continue this conversation. So next, I want to just talk a little bit about how we do this particular update. So Ancestry has a reference panel of people from around the world that represent those different regions. So we are not testing people who lived thousands of years ago. We are testing living people who have deep roots singularly in a single place, meaning all of their known ancestors within a few generations come from the same place. Most of us don't have that in our family tree, and so it's a lot of work to find people to include in the reference panel. We have to, validate family history information and compare them against other people from that region to see if their DNA looks the same. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And in different years, right, because our geneticists work all year long in order to do the research that feeds into this update each year. In different years, we focus on different regions of the world and in gathering more samples for that population of people. So Ancestry, with this update, has dramatically increased the number of people whose DNA is in that reference panel. It is now at 185,000 people from 146 different regions around the world. And so we use their DNA as a representative of that place, and then that's the first thing, creating the reference panel, improving the reference panel, strengthening the reference panel, focusing it, seeing if we can tease apart different regions based on the data we have in that reference panel. And that is a whole body of work that, like I said, is ongoing constantly by the Ancestry DNA science team. Then we have an algorithm that we are constantly refining and tuning and working with the cutting edge of science and technology so that we can take that reference panel and we can compare your DNA against that reference panel in order to provide you with this breakdown. So that is kind of how the process works. What that means is that each time we update your Ancestry DNA results, we are comparing you to an increased number of people in the reference panel, an increased number or more refined number of regions around the world, and running it through the latest algorithm with the technology that we have to do that comparison. So that's one of the reasons why we do an update every year, is because we're constantly doing work on those two things, the reference panel and the algorithm. So when you first took an Ancestry DNA test, your results may have been a little bit broad. I know I took the AncestryDNA test back in the spring of 2012, which is when Ancestry introduced AncestryDNA, autosomal DNA testing. And the regions of the world at the time were pretty broad. As a matter of fact, basically what we could tell you was whether you were Indigenous American, and by that we meant all of the Americas, North, Central, and South. We could tell you if you were European, African, or Asian, right? Like basically 4 regions in the world, really clearly delineated based on the DNA. It's a little bit like comparing your DNA to just 4 colors, right? We can tell, you know, white, black, red, yellow. That's it. Like those were the DNA. That was the options. And when you're comparing your DNA to just 4 colors, we could tell you which of those 4 buckets you fit into. But as we start to add more color, we can get more nuanced in how we compare your DNA. So rather than just saying you're Indigenous American, as you can see from the map here, we can now tell you whether or not you belong to one of these 14 different Indigenous American regions. Rather than telling you you're just African, we can tell you whether you belong to one or more of these 22 different regions in Africa. We can tell you for Asia, 35 different regions that we've been able to focus in on and tease apart the differences in the DNA. There are 68 regions in Europe, and then there are an additional 7 regions in what is called Oceania. So that is how the results keep improving, is we go from continental level comparisons to adding nuance and shade and precision around more specific regions. But one of the things that I need you to notice is that many of these regions overlap. And that's because people do not reproduce in boundaries of countries, right? Country boundaries are simply lines on a map, and they are lines on a map that for the last 1,000 years have changed repeatedly. Not only have the country boundaries changed, but the populations of people migrating in and through those areas is constant, and more so in different places in the world than in others. And so you think about how somebody might say that they're from a particular place, but that's not necessarily where their family has always lived. They may reproduce with somebody in the local population, and then they may move on, and now they've left behind 50% of their DNA in that place that then gets propagated through successive generations. So think about like the movement of people over time, the fact that country boundaries are just lines on a map, that they do not necessarily hold people, and that they have been shifting for all of time, but certainly over the last 1,000 years or so. The other thing that I want you to consider as you start to think about what your DNA results might reveal is how much of your family tree you actually know. So I just did a little exercise last night, and I'll have to post this on, I'm gonna see if I can pull it up. I'm gonna have to post this over on Facebook or Instagram so that you all can see it. I've made it downloadable as well, but here is, let me see. I'm gonna pull it up and then I'm gonna share my screen. Here is a little chart that I have made. How do I zoom in? And then I need to share. There we go. Okay. Here is a little chart that I've made, because what I wanted to understand was how much of my family tree do I really know? Because I think we identify so strongly with what we know in our family tree, and it never occurs to us what we don't know in our family tree. And your DNA has been inherited through all of time, but what we're looking at when we give you your origins is where in the world your DNA was 500 to 1,000 years ago. And I don't know about you, but my tree on all branches does not go back 500 to 1,000 years. Instead, it goes back really far on some lines, and then other lines just completely stop. So here's the little comparison chart that I worked up last night. It's called What's Your Number? And like I said, I'll share this. I'll put a link to it maybe in the YouTube comments so that people can download a blank copy of this if they want to do this exercise for themselves. I'll share this over on my social media channels. But here's how you read this. You are generation 1. And there is one of you, and hopefully you know who you are. You have 2 parents, and most of us know who both of our biological parents are. Obviously not everyone, but so I know both of mine. I know who all 4 of my grandparents are, and who all 8 of my great-grandparents are, and who all 16 of my great-great-grandparents are. And I've proven that to my satisfaction, both through records, documentary evidence, as well as genetic evidence. I have DNA matches that strongly connect me all the way back to all 16 of my great-great-grandparents. Now, when you get to my 6th generation, which is my 3 times great-grandparents, I only know 30 out of the possible 32 people in that generation, the 32 spots on my family tree. Which means by the time you get back to that generation, I only know 93% of those ancestors. And then it drops like a rock because as soon as you're missing the parents of one person in your family tree, in the next generation, right, you're going to be missing 4, and then in the next generation, 8, right? And I also start, with some more holes in that 7th generation. So out of my 64 possible spots in my family tree, I only have 50 of them filled in at generation 7. Out of 128 at generation 8, I only know 86 of them. At generation 9, 256 possible ancestors, I only know 124 of them. And by generation 10, out of 512 possible ancestors, I only know 128 of them. And for me, this 7 times great-grandparents only gets me back to about the late 1600s. So not anywhere near 500 to 1,000 years ago. And so when I'm thinking about my DNA origins, I have to consider that at my 10th generation, which is only about 300 years ago, I only know 25% of my ancestors. I've only identified 25% of them. So that is one of the things that I want you to keep in mind, again, as you look at your origins. And that doesn't even take into account the idea that at any point along the way, somebody may have been misidentified, either through the records, me doing the research wrong in some way, taking a left turn and climbing somebody else's family tree, or somebody may not actually be the biological father or mother of the person they were purported to be the parent of. And so even if I think I know who that person is, I might not have the genetic evidence yet to back that up. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration when you go to view your AncestryDNA origins results. That said, our science team continues to work to refine these, to make them as easy to understand as possible, and to give you some direction into how to use these results to continue to make family history discoveries. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and dive into my results as an example. I'll walk you through some of the changes and updates that have been made. And then if you have specific questions, we can have a little Q&A session to talk about those. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to come here. So to get to your DNA origins results, you're going to click on the DNA tab, and you will see origins listed on that drop-down menu. And most of you should see an updated tag. Again, these results were updated on October 9th for everyone, all 27 million of you who have taken an Ancestry DNA test. The first thing that I want you to look at is regions. That's where it goes when you click that. The regions are what was updated. You will see here, I have 13 ancestral regions. And like always, there is a breakdown of the percentage of my connection to those regions. And some of those regions, actually many of those regions, are listed as new. And the reason they're listed as new is because previously we had a single region. And when we can take that region and break it out into multiple regions, we're going to rename it. We work with a team of outside scholars and historians, academics, and people who are doing research in these regions of the world. We work with them closely in order to name these regions. And that's always a tricky thing, right? How you name the regions is kind of the challenge we have, right? Because we currently, in today's world, think in terms of countries and country borders. My grandfather was German. Well, yeah, but Germany didn't exist as a unified country until 1867, the first time, right? Before that, it was a series of kingdoms and duchies, and they had different political alliances with different countries around them, right? So Germany is an interesting thing, right? It doesn't look now like it did 30 or 40 years ago, and it didn't look then like it did 40 years before that. And right, like it is one of those places in the world where the borders have changed repeatedly, where there has been lots of migration in and out of that place. So every time we have to create new regions, whether it's a new region in the world or a breakout from a previous region, we have to think really hard about how to name that. And so we work with a lot of scholars and historians to do that as appropriately as possible. But we also want to name it something you're going to recognize or be able to identify with. And so giving it historic names gets a little tricky as well. So do you see the challenge? So this is where we land, is on these names. I have all of these new regions, and it's because previously they were a single region that has now been broken out into multiple regions. And so these are newly named regions. And then I have a couple of trace regions down here, small percentages, where I still have the same small percentages. Some of you may see some of those small percentages come and go. I've seen a few questions about that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, the other change that we made, in addition to breaking some larger regions into smaller regions, the other change that we made is that we are now showing you your results nested under macro regions. Here's what I mean by that, and here's why we did that. A macro region is simply a larger area that we can say these places are part of that larger area. And the reason we did that is because these lists, for some of us, are getting long. Now, I only have 13 regions. Some of you, if you're Ashkenazi Jewish or 100% Irish, some of you may just have one. Some of you have 20 or 30. I think the most I've ever seen on one person is 31 different regions. Maybe you have more. If you do, let us know in the chat or the comments. That those lists were getting really long for some people. And we were showing you that list in descending order based on the percentages. So you have this, most of this, and then this, and then this, and then this. The challenge was there was no way to see groupings of regions to understand, well, how much African am I, or how much Indigenous American am I, or how much, right? Like there was no grouping of those. They would appear randomly in the list depending on how much DNA you shared with them. So we've nested these under macro regions. Now, I mentioned everyone got the updated origins percentages and names on October 9th. However, not everybody has the macro regions yet. So that the organization or the display of your results might still just look like the full list. That is coming for everyone by December. So everybody's results will be updated to look kind of like the way that mine are organized. So you're going to see, again, macro regions with the smaller regions nested under that. Now, some of those macro regions have names that you might not be familiar with. And again, it's this tension between 500 to 1,000 years ago, what were those places or those populations of people called versus the actual country borders, because those have shifted so much over time. So Celtic and Gaelic is, for example, a region, a macro region that encompasses, as you can see from my results, a lot of Ireland and Scotland. So that's where those populations of people are found. You're going to see Central and Eastern Europe. You're going to see Iberian. You're going to see some of these macro regions in your results, but nested under them is where you're going to see those specific percentages. Okay. The first thing I want you to do, if you haven't already, is not just skim through these, though that's interesting. I want you to click through to view each of your regions, because this that you're looking at here is just really, really high level information. And a lot of the questions that I'm seeing pop up in the chat are actually answered if you click through to view the regions. So whether your question was about Indigenous American or African populations or wherever in the world your DNA shows you're from, you can do this. And I think it will help make sense of some things. So I have this top population here. 23% of my DNA comes from southeastern England and northwestern Europe. And when I click through to view that, the first thing I'm going to see is a map. So if you have questions about why it's called something, always look at the map. The map is going to show you kind of these heat map shaped polygons, right? Where there's a concentrated center and then sometimes lighter concentric polygons outside of that concentrated center. What this map is showing you is this piece of your DNA, 23% of my DNA comes from this part of the world, and that DNA is concentrated in these places. So you can see Southeast England, right, and Northwest Europe. But that includes parts of the Netherlands and Belgium and part of Luxembourg and part of France, right? You can see that other countries are included. And then if you go out to this outer circle, you see it touches over here into Germany and a little bit into Switzerland, right? So the expansiveness of where that DNA is found doesn't always necessarily precisely match the title of the region. Northwestern Europe covers a lot of ground. Another thing I want you to pay attention to is the list over here. Like if you don't want to read the map, you can come here and you can see here are where in the world this DNA is found. So primarily it's in England, but it's also found in these places, what we currently call these country names. So pay attention to that. And then, oh, I'm going to zoom out just a smidge because I was zoomed way in so I could make my screen bigger for you. There we go. Okay. And then I want you to scroll down, and if you have an AncestryDNA subscription, you're going to be able to see which parent you inherited that particular region from. And for some of you, this will still just say parent 1 and parent 2. And that's because your DNA doesn't come labeled in your body, parent 1, parent 2. But we can tell that some of it comes from one side and some comes from the other side. You then can look at your match list and your origins. If you have parents who are ethnically distinct, you can usually tell which parent is parent 1 and which parent is parent 2. Those are not going to be the same for everyone. So your parent one may be your mother, and my parent one may be my father. So parent one, parent two. You can edit those labels. And then it will show up as paternal and maternal. Everywhere you can see this features that are informed by the Ancestry side view technology. So you can look at that. You can also see journeys. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about journeys here in just a minute, but you can see journeys connected to that particular region. You can see the other regions nested under the same macro region. And you can also see some of your DNA matches who are connected to that particular region. So I want you to explore these pages. We spend a lot of time putting these together to answer your questions, and so that's going to help you understand them a little bit. Now, you don't have to go back out to the main origins page. You can just arrow your way through each of these, okay? And it will give you, you can explore them that way, okay? Okay, so those are your regions. Let's talk a little bit about small percentage regions. Ancestry runs your DNA through the algorithm against the reference panel lots and lots and lots of times. And then we average those together. And this number that you see here, this 23% or 22%, is an average of all of the numbers. And so when you get down here to some of these smaller numbers, 4%, 1%, 2%, 3%, it's very likely that in several of those runs of your DNA through the algorithm, that it was 0. And so we're showing you the average, but several of you have asked the question, how come I had a region and now I don't have a region? Well, it could be because this time, with the increased number of people in the reference panel, it was 0 enough times that we're not showing it and that we actually assigned that percentage to a neighboring region. So if you've got a shift in the percentages or a region that has dropped off of your list, that is likely what has happened. So if you look, again, pay attention to the map, where are the overlapping fuzzy edges, right, between two what we think of as countries or regions in the world or populations or places that we identify within our family tree. Could that DNA still be found in that same spot on the map? But instead of reading it as this region, we're reading it as this region, right? So the way that it gets read in the algorithm and the number of times that test gets read is what determines this percentage. But it is a range, and that range, especially in those smaller percentages, can go down all the way to 0. Even in the higher percentages, it can get shifted to a neighboring region depending on who's in that reference panel and how they've been identified as connecting to a particular population. So I think there's a lot of you who have asked questions about that specifically, and it looks like for some of you that is answering the question. Okay. So another question that is coming up, and I'll answer 2 really specific questions about 2 really specific regions because I'm seeing a lot of chatter about that. The first one is about Indigenous American. As I mentioned, when Ancestry first started doing DNA testing, we could absolutely tell if somebody has inherited Indigenous American DNA. It is very distinct and definable. But at the time, it was just Indigenous America, whether you were from Alaska or Oklahoma or North Carolina or Guatemala or Peru, it all looked the same, distinct, but the same. Now, we've been able to break out Indigenous American into 14 different regions. And so we can be much more precise with how we connect you if you've inherited Indigenous American DNA to certain populations of people or regions. What we cannot do is connect you to a specific tribe. And that is for a lot of reasons, both genetic and kind of social and historical, the way that tribes mixed, the way that tribes migrated, means that there's not clean or clear edges oftentimes to some of that. But if somebody is from southwestern United States, or if they are Inuit, or if they are, like we can tell some of that based on the regions where your indigenous DNA is showing up, okay? So if you have indigenous DNA, we absolutely can detect it. And we can break it into one of these or more of these 14 regions, but we don't get down to the tribal level. The next question that I'm seeing come up quite a bit here in the chat has to do with French and Quebec. So one of the things that you may or may not be aware of is that DNA testing is not, consumer DNA testing is not legal in France. And so the number of people who are pure French and identify as French and have strong French documented family trees that have taken the Ancestry DNA test, or even the scientific reference panels that Ancestry uses from academic studies and other places, is really minimal. And so that means that detecting that French DNA gets a little bit tricky. With this particular update, we have an increase in the number of people who are connected to French Canada, to Quebec. And so some of you who have French DNA may be seeing an increase in a connection to Quebec as the region where your DNA is coming from because of that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's something we're aware of. It's something that we will continue to work on, but that right now is the limitation for that. Which actually brings me really beautifully to the Ancestry DNA journeys. So this update that just happened on October 9th was specifically for the regions in your Ancestry DNA origins, the things that have percentages. However, we update Ancestry DNA journeys all year long. That is something that happens on a continual basis. There are one of two ways that you will receive an Ancestry DNA journey. The first one is, as more and more people take the Ancestry DNA test, what starts to happen with 27 million people who've tested is we start to notice clusters of people that match each other in some fashion. Now, it doesn't mean every single person in that cluster matches every single other person, but you'll have these like groups of people that start to form in clusters. And when we see a cluster form, our team goes to work to figure out what is it about this group of people that makes them so interrelated to one another. And we can drill in then to family tree data and start to look to see, do these people have a place in common? And so that's how journeys are created, is by looking for clusters of matches within the data and then trying to identify that common place for that cluster. The second way that you might get a new journey, and then we publish those. So when we find new journeys, after extensive research, we will publish them, and we publish new journeys every few months. And so you might get a new journey when it's discovered. Then there are existing journeys that maybe there's this cluster of people that exists, but you only match a few of them. And so there's not enough strong enough tie to pull you into that journey. But as more people test, some of these clusters grow and expand and the connections strengthen and tighten. And so you might get pulled into an existing journey as more people continue to test. So that's the two ways that you might get a new journey. A new journey is discovered and published, or an existing journey, your connection to that is strengthened or tightened because of additional DNA matches that have shown up on your match list. Now, when you think about journeys, here's what I want you to think about, and then we'll take a look at mine. I mentioned that your Ancestry DNA regions are where in the world your DNA was 500 to 1,000 years ago, based on this 185,000 person reference panel that is a modeled population of 146 regions around the world. Your journeys are showing you where you have family that has lived within the last couple hundred years. And because of the nature of these clusters or these connections, these networks of matches, in some cases, we can get really precise. I think the smallest journey that I've seen is like a 10-mile radius around a particular location. Now, there are also overlapping journeys, just like there are overlapping regions, but often we can tell the difference because of things like ethnicity, origin, like where in the regions that they came from to get there. And so if you've got a group of people in North Carolina who all are European and a group of people in North Carolina who are all African, we can tell the difference, even though they cover the same spot of ground in North Carolina, that they are from two different journeys. And in fact, that is why we call them journeys, because it is showing you the migration of people over time in distinct groups or populations. And it also means we can connect you back to an origin population. So for those of you who have that Quebec and it surprised you, just know that that actually is starting to kind of bridge the gap a little bit between regions and journeys. Those Quebecois, that founding population there, it's only been there for 400 or 500 years. So it's kind of on the cusp of where we look at for regions, and then the last 300 years, which is where we look at for journeys. But you know, obviously, that Quebecois founding population came from France originally. So even if we don't have a robust sampling yet from France, there is an understanding of the historical nature of the migration of that population of people. And so that is what we try to show you in the journeys. So I'm going to share my journeys with you. I only have two, but I do want to point out a couple of important things. So to get to your journeys, like the default when you go to your DNA origins is regions. To get to your journeys, you just click the little journeys tab here, and that will show you your journeys. So again, my regions are where my DNA was 500 to 1,000 years ago, those original populations of people. My journeys is how those populations of people have migrated to different places over the last few hundred years. So I have one that is what we call early Upper South settlers, particularly concentrated in Tennessee. And then I have one that is Utah settlers. Now, because I know my family tree, I know this one comes from my mother and this one comes from my father. As a matter of fact, in my tree, I know that I have people born in those specific locations. And that's what these little numbers on these dots mean. Because I have built my family tree and attached my family tree to my DNA results, it can overlay my tree data onto this information. So as I zoom in, let me find my little, there we go. I just needed to move the zoom menu out of the way so that I could zoom in. There we go. As I zoom in, what you'll notice is these little dots with numbers on them. And in fact, both of my mom's parents were born right here in the little northwest corner of Arkansas, and the family has lived there for since the 1830s. They came to Northwest Arkansas from Northeast Tennessee. And so that is the migration or the journey that this specific family took. Now, I can, just like with the regions, you can click through to the journeys, and I hope that you will, because again, we've spent a lot of time and effort working with historians and other scholars to make sure that this information is accurate and informative. But my favorite thing about this, as you drill into it, is the timeline. So the timeline actually shows you how those populations have moved over the last 300 years or so. So this community of people, this population of people that I'm connected to, has made this following journey. So this is where it is currently located, but it started here. In the 1700s, people were coming from Germany and England, a couple of different places in England, and they were migrating into these places here in Virginia. And in fact, I have a couple of people in my family tree who then made their way out to Tennessee. And so that's the early 1700s. And then in the mid to late 1700s, right around the time of the Revolutionary War, some of those people made their way down into the Carolinas and out to Tennessee. And then as we move on to post-Revolutionary War period of time, right? Like, so it's showing you where they came from, how they migrated, and then we can drill in on more specific information. And again, because I have my tree attached to my DNA results, at every point, it's going to show me people in my tree connected to that part of the journey in time. And so you'll start to see here are the migration paths that these people often took. And if your tree's attached, you'll see the little dots with the numbers. Those are where people in your tree were born. And then you start to see the movement from Tennessee across and then out to Arkansas. And then some of them, of course, end up in California, which ultimately is where my mother was born. So my family takes this exact migration path over the last 300 years. I know that because I've done a lot of family history research. If your tree doesn't go back that far, or you don't know yet how you're connected to this particular journey, this is a great opportunity to focus your research into those specific places, because that is going to connect you to genealogically discoverable information way faster than these regions. I don't know where to look in southeastern England and northwestern Europe for where 23% of my DNA is if I can't even trace my family back to the time period that these journeys represent. So that's where you can focus. And in order to do that, we've also provided you with the ability to filter your match list based on journey. Who are the other people that I am DNA matched to that are connected to this specific migration of people? I think that that's a really important point to end on, which is just that's what I hope you're using your DNA results for ultimately, is to make more discoveries in your family tree and more connections to your ancestors and your cousins, to continue to make more discoveries about yourself and your own family story. Now, unlike the origins, journeys actually should be looked at in aggregate across multiple people who've tested in your family tree. So we started the top of the hour talking about the random inheritance of DNA and how you got 50% of mom's DNA and 50% of dad's DNA, and it was a random 50%, and your sister got a different random 50%. And so when you look at your results together, which you can do with the compare feature on Ancestry, especially when you're looking at journeys, you might notice that she is more genetically tightly tied to a particular journey that you didn't get. And that's because she got a different random 50% of mom and dad's DNA than you got. At some point, you may be pulled into that journey, but for now, you can explore all of them across your siblings, or like I said, any parents or grandparents that you've been able to DNA test. So in my family, we've been able to test both of my parents, and we were able to test one of my grandparents before she passed. And that particular grandparent has 3 journeys, and I only got one of them, which means there are 2 more places in the world that I can explore using her DNA that I wouldn't have even known about if I was the only person that I had tested. When I look at my dad and his siblings and my siblings and my first cousins that have all tested, I can see that we all inherited different journeys from grandma through our dads. So I only got the one, but all 3 are represented between my siblings and my cousins and I. So if I hadn't been able to test grandma, I still would have been connected to those journeys because of the fact that we tested siblings and cousins. Hopefully this was useful. I've been keeping an eye on the chat and your questions. I know a lot of you still have questions. If we did not get to your question today, would you please, if you're here watching this with us live, would you please, in a few days, go out and check on the Ancestry YouTube channel. We'll post this video, and I want you to ask your question there. We'll be watching that. We'll be answering those. We want to make sure that you have the information that you need. I would also highly encourage you to explore your DNA results. We have included FAQ information, so look for those links, help materials, look for those links, and explore those a little bit on your own. So you don't have to come back necessarily and look for an answer or wait for an answer. The answers to most of the questions you have, we've tried to provide you right there in the Origins experience with different FAQ and help materials. So I hope you'll explore those. But if you have a question further after that, by all means, please let us know. We're more than happy to help. Ancestry DNA update is one of my favorite times of the year, not just because it falls in October, which is National Family History Month, but also because it continues to provide more resolution, more detail, more things to explore, and ultimately, it also brings more people back to the site. And that is always a good thing because it means some of my matches who might not have read my messages lately might be coming back and notice they have a message. People get excited about it and they might get other people tested. And now I have more matches. And all of that is in service of me exploring more of my family history and you exploring more of yours. Well, that is all I have for you today. Before you go, would you please, in the chat or in the comments, just leave a quick sentence or 2 about one new thing you learned today. That's super important for us as we continue to craft these Wednesday virtual events for you, that we know what people are learning and what's resonating. And it's also super useful for you to articulate what you learned because then you're more likely to remember it. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.